Hello, and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you for another hour of podcasting greatness here on YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, and who knows what other platforms we've migrated to since. So this week, I am welcoming back Dr. James Lindsay, and he is a mathematician by education, but has gotten very involved in, I guess you could say, critique of social activism. Amongst other things, he has been on the show before, and I highly recommend that you guys check out our earlier podcast, which I will put a link to in the description section to this video so you can catch up with what we've said in the past, because we've covered, talked quite extensively about social justice warriors and social activism and how that has become in itself a kind of religion, or, could be analogized to that in many, many ways. I mean, not accurately speaking, it's not a religion, but it is analogous to it. And Dr. Lindsay actually wrote a whole paper breaking all this down, and we talked about that. So I invited him back because I'm seeing and hearing things that, and in a way, experiencing a little bit on my channel right now, a little bit of wokeness. And this is a term that I am curious about, got interested in, started looking into, like, what's this all about? Turns out I'm a little late on the whole cycle of the word. It's kind of dying off now, which is probably a good thing. And Dr. Lindsay, welcome to the show. And let's go ahead and talk about this.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about with the woke thing. I think that if you want a description of what I do, this gets really kind of in the weeds to even, I figured out what I'm doing. And it feels good to figure out what you're doing. It's hard to explain what I'm doing, but I'm building a traditional theory of critical theory is essentially what I'm doing. And the woke movement falls within the evolution of critical theory as it's been put into practice and in scholarship over the past, we're getting on close to 100 years, 90 to 100 years now. So it's firmly within that tradition. And a guy, Max Horkheimer, one of the earliest critical theorists, and we don't have to get lost in this, but in 1937, he wrote a book called Critical and Traditional Theories, where he outlined the need for both and the differences between them. And so a traditional theory is what we normally think of as an explanatory theory that tries to understand a thing as it is. And a critical theory is a approach that tries to understand how say a traditional theory, a system, a way of knowing, a way of being, or something like that, falls short of moral perfection, where the problematics in it lie.
Oh, is that
and
that
it has
means?
to be. Yes.
I'm glad you're clarifying this, because I didn't even know I didn't know this.
This is what a critical theory actually is. And so it's actually different than critical thinking. Its root is in critique, which you can trace back to Marx in particular, his idea of critique. Karl Marx said that the necessary thing to do is to criticize everything ruthlessly in order to expose, essentially, and this is actually when I say that we're talking about a form of critique, the point was to expose oppression and to effect liberation from oppression. So critical theories, that's the moral framework that they have, is to expose oppression and to create liberation from that oppression, or to effect liberation. So emancipation, liberation, liberatory, all of these kinds of words, liberationism, are all associated with the critical theory methodology. And it all depends on, of course, where people see power happening. The critical theory school had its beliefs about where power was. The postmodernists have their beliefs. Libertarians have different beliefs, but some still take up critical methods. So I am trying now to create a traditional theory, an explanatory theory of critical theory, because it seems like, as you just kind of reacted, nobody has a clue what's going on. And a lot of what's happened, frankly, since the magic year is, for many reasons, 1968. Since then, we have essentially had a proliferation of critical theory throughout society, and both on right and on the left. And that's how our culture war has become so gnarly. And that actually gets us to wokeness, which is one side of that culture war. And as I said, takes up a particular vein of critical theory as it's evolved through history.
Fascinating. So we're being critical of critical theory.
We're being perspicacious about critical theory, but nobody knows what perspicacious
No,
means.
I was just about to say, what was that word?
It's like I learned that word and I was like, this is the word I've needed for so long. And then it's like, shit, nobody knows it. So I don't know what to do. It means knowing what you're talking about.
Oh.
So a perspicacious theory is something that knows what it's talking about. It knows the details. It knows the ins and outs, as opposed to something that's just, again, the difference being with traditional theory, you're trying to understand those things. With critical theory, you're just trying to criticize and point out how it goes wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So since I know there's like roots to atheism here, a traditional theory of religion would try to understand religion and what it does, how it behaves, what characterizes a religion, what psychological inputs or sociological inputs are relevant to religion, and so on, and try to create a very robust understanding and model that maybe tries to understand it on its own terms and on outsiders' terms. A very big thing. A critical theory of religion, which is what a lot of the atheist movement ended up being, is just saying, look at this bad thing that happens because of religion. Look at this other bad thing that happens because of religion. And you can tell when somebody gets caught up in one of these critical theories because they start to see the problematics everywhere. So they're driving down the road and they see like, McDonald's 1 trillion served or something like that. And they're like, that's because of religion. They're seeing it everywhere. And that's actually kind of what happens with critical theory. And it turns out, like I said, the vision in the original in the Frankfurt School is what it was called, the Institute for Social Research that was set up in Frankfurt, Germany, and migrated to Geneva, then to the U.S., both in New York City at Columbia and in L.A. I don't know exactly where in L.A. Theodore Adorno set up camp. But anyway, Southern California and New York City were the two main beds in the U.S. And so their original idea was that traditional theories, in other words, science, Enlightenment philosophy, and so on, are not sufficient because they leave these spaces where problematics happen that cause oppression and prevent liberation from oppression, and even allow the rise of fascism. So we have to go in and problematize. We have to add this extra dimension, critical theory, to show where the unexamined assumptions are, to question that which isn't being questioned, to look into the role of biases and self-interested power and all these. So they said we need to add this in. And then what happens is it turns out critical theory is really easy and traditional theory is really hard. And so what happens when you set that loose in the masses is that most people aren't doing the hard thing. They just do the easy thing. And it actually becomes sort of addictive because you get massive amounts of social cred, which is addictive, dopamine city, by dunking on something or by throwing out a hot take that goes viral. These are all critical theory tools. Hot takes, dunking, it's critical theory.
That's right.
So
that's a very good point.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating. It's almost like the internet was made for both critical theory and, in particular, postmodern, denial of universal truth and so on. It's like an interface with postmodernity, and so now we're like, crap.
That's right. I was going to bring that up. It seems like it's built on a bedrock of postmodernism, postmodern theory, and it seems that Twitter especially is built for this.
As I have said a few times now and in writing, Twitter is a deconstruction machine.
Yes, it really is. And talk about unintended consequences. I mean, do you think Jack Dorsey put that together with that in mind?
No, I think he was literally thinking it would be fun and cute to create a platform where people just put out their brain farts. Here's what I'm doing. I think his original idea, if I recall having seen and read an interview about this or something, was that, it's like you're in a coffee shop and you hear the twittering voices around you. And if you could actually hear what people are saying and, you pick up little snippets of conversation, it's like, how do you put a platform for that? And then, I mean, when Twitter first started, I wasn't there when it first started, but I got involved before it got really insane. And it was a much friendlier and simpler place. And, the tweets, it was very difficult to understand what the point of it was because it was very much like coffee shop chatter. And then somehow politics landed on Twitter, and the whole place, it's like a freaking nightmare. It is, I think, genuinely a deconstruction machine. You can't put anything out there, especially if you have a decent sized account, without it just getting ripped to shreds. I mean, the last thing I tweeted before I sat down to talk to you on the podcast, I put something about saying that wokeness, as it turns out, in education isn't going to go away until people start to understand it and fight against it. And like within seconds, some guy writes back to me, that won't stop it either.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, it's just everything you put is like tears it down. You put some kind of, you put, here's my lunch, and they're like, that's gross, or it looks terrible, or how can you eat that, or that's bad for you, or it's bad for the planet. It's just, there's thousands of people ready to jump on just about anything. It tears apart any meaning that might have been in the thing that you thought you wanted to share, and puts it in terms of other people's ideas. So this is like, it'll deconstruct a person. I think I'm being deconstructed actually by it. And what I've been telling people, like when they ask me, it's like, well, what's up with all that, if I get talking about it? And I'll say, I feel like I live entirely in other people's thoughts now. It's like I'm not allowed to have my own thoughts. I have to live entirely in other people's thoughts. And that's not good. So I don't think Jack Dorsey intended that we would all live in each other's thoughts, like, and be torn apart psychologically by them. But
here we are. That's right. I've called it the id of the internet, right? It's sort of our collective id. To go Freudian, which is, loosey-goosey terminology, but it works. And
I saw a neuroscientist that called it the amygdala of the internet.
Yes. Yes, that's right. And it's interesting. I want to go on this. I want to go back to this critical theory thing, because I'm still kind of like, oh wow, that's actually a thing. Because you had referred constantly to critical race theory, and I really didn't quite get. I was thinking, I was sort of making up a definition for it in my head of, oh, well, they're being critical of ideas about race, and and putting it into academic terms, and therefore it's critical race theory. But now that you've explained this other way, I'm like, oh, I get this. Because you see this all throughout the atheist world, and I'll say that I think as time goes on, it sort of reminds me a bit of the stages of leaving a belief system. An extremist, or I could say extremist belief system, but really I think almost any belief system, when you wake up that belief system, suddenly you're aware of okay, tell me if you agree with this. You get part of a group, you are all about its beliefs, principles, mantras, ideas, you buy into it, you think it's all great, you tend then, psychologically, you understand why this happens, you tend to only look at the pluses, avoid the minuses, cognitive dissonance your way through problems, because every group has problems, every group has drama, every group has issues, right? Not just at the human level either, but at an idea level, there are problems. There's no perfect system, no perfect group. So you ignore that stuff because that's how we're built. Because you can't be part of a group if you're constantly harping on all the outnesses. That makes you not a group member. And in fact, what happens is you get so involved in the group that your ability to think critically about it descends to almost zero. That's when you hit extremism. But then somehow, at some point, something wakes you up. Something makes you realize that there's something critical about this, something bad about this, that you can't cognitive dissonance your way through. It's undeniable. Usually that's why it has to be a personal event, because that's what really hits people, is when stuff hits them personally. So something like that happens. Suddenly you cannot deny that this outness exists, and suddenly that makes you aware of this outness and this outness and this outness. Suddenly you're like, oh my God, I didn't see this before. I didn't see this before. I didn't see this before. And now all of the luster is off, right? It's tarnished. And now you're like, oh, this wasn't what I thought it was. True enough statement. It's not what you thought it was. It never was. You then go, oh my God. And depending on the level of betrayal or, moral, whatever that hits you, your response will then be, oh, this is not just not good, this is bad.
Yeah.
This is awful. This is misrepresenting itself. This is abusive. This, and maybe, of course, like with Scientology or destructive cults, there is actual abuse.
Right.
But that doesn't actually have to be there for what I'm describing to happen.
Correct.
You know, and then you become whoop, and you turn, right? And there's this turn that happens. And during that period, when that first happens, just like you're in the position where when you first join the group, you can't imagine anything bad about it, you then flip to, I can't imagine anything good about it.
Correct.
And then you have a whole stages to go through. You know?
Right. I call that stage throwing rocks at the cathedral.
There we go. And you're doing that. And I think for most of us, that's a stage.
It is. I think so.
Yeah. And I wanted to, so what do you think about that little layout I'm making there? It seems like if
I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I think it's exactly right. The psychological processes involved are probably complex, but that is the big picture description. That's kind of what I figured out probably in 2013 or 14 that led me to sort of change directions entirely and kind of start dissociating myself from the atheist movement as it was, and even wrote a book within atheism, if you will, that was critical of the atheist movement. That I published at the end of 2015. I wrote it through 14 and 15 combined and published at the end of 2015. And I think that that's accurate. I also think that it's a phase that you do have to go through to kind of psychologically untangle yourself from that. It's called parochial altruism, where you've been forgiving the inside group and blaming out groups or whatever. And it's like you kind of have to like undo that for yourself. So all those lies that you told yourself to convince all along, it's like you kind of get pissed off at yourself or something, and then you throw the rock at the cathedral and blame the system that tricked you into believing it. And I do think, like I said, it's a phase, and it's also a phase that you should grow out of. It's you work through that whether you do externally or not, and then you should grow out of it. And the issue starts becoming when you turn it into a the only allowable way to theorize or conceptualize that thing. So within atheism, it's just all religion is bad all the time. You never quite get over, for a lot of people who left religion and became atheist activists, it was very obvious, and still is when it happens, very obvious that they're pissed off at the church. And if they never finish working through that, and it's all just religion's always bad, it's bad in all its forms, and they just keep throwing rocks at the cathedral, that's actually, that's sort of where it becomes this critical theory thing, because it's, like I said, cheap and easy to do a critical theory.
Exactly. So now okay, good. So if I'm on the right track here and we're talking apples and apples, then let me now extend this out a little bit further and propose this next stage of this, which is the activist, the critical theorist. And I've been a critical theorist against Scientology, against religion in general, of course.
Same here.
And now that I have had the time and distance to look at, and I've been doing nothing but for the last 7 years, but looking at this stuff really hard. I think I've now moved over to the more general, traditional theory look at this, because you start recognizing, oh no, there's not all bad. There's good here and here and here. And if I'm really going to be intellectually honest, I have to acknowledge that. And if you're not lost in a moral fog or trauma, because a lot of people are trauma survivors, and that has its own psychological baggage.
And its own relevance.
Yes, big time. And that kind of foments and continues it, because trauma survivors definitely have all kinds of feelings of survivor guilt and the spectrum is wide.
Right.
But where I'm trying to go here is, so a lot of people tone down, figure things out, come out of the critical theory mindset, go into more general theory, go, oh yeah, no, it's actually, there's good and bad, and let's kind of have more nuanced conversations about this. But there are those who become activists, become popular for that view, and therefore kind of have to, maybe some people feel like when they get in that position, they have to maintain that point of view.
Hmm.
But then what happens in the little evolution of ideas here is now this person is pushing this critical theory, and people who've never had anything to do with this one way or the other, that's their first exposure to this topic.
Hmm.
And they buy into the critical theory as the ultimate truth about this entire topic because that's all they've heard.
Right.
And I think that's where a lot of these students are sitting.
Right. That's exactly
Right? Who are
right.
being taught by these guys who never came out of that critical. They went into it for whatever reason they individually had, and there could be a panoply of reasons, but they are now stuck in this postmodern critical race theory, critical gender theory thing. And it's this position, and they've built a whole empire on it. And now we're going to teach these kids, and these kids now get this because they have no life experience, and so they go, well, this all sounds very smooth and put together and sensible, because look, there's oppression, there's black people getting killed, and there's minorities being oppressed, and so this must all be true.
Right.
And now we have a cult, right? So there you
Right.
go. And I think that's how it rolls out. I don't know, what do you think?
I mean, I think that that's generally probably the correct picture. What I kept thinking about when we were talking about, most people grow out of it. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, some people don't. They end up they have their reasons, or the reason might be that it's become their job, or they've gotten a lot of status out of being a critical theorist. Famous ones like Judith Butler, as a critical gender theorist come to mind.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, how is she not going to do that anymore?
Mm-hmm.
That's everything of her career stretching back almost 40 years. How is she not going to do that? Besides the fact that she's just trained herself to think that way so deeply at that point. But there's always a fresh crop to bring in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so easy to point at things. I actually like that you brought up, it sounds really weird to phrase it this way, but I like that you brought up the black people being killed thing as being something you can point at.
Mm.
Because again, this critical theory is happening from multiple directions. Uh, Generally, a critical theory is trying to spin a narrative and control a narrative because it thinks that everything is narratives. And
Mm-hmm.
so the recent example in the news of the black jogger who was shot, and then now you've got this very complicated story coming out, new
Mm-hmm.
piece of information here, new piece of information there. And so I was thinking about it the other day, and it's like you have the right-wing narrative, oh, he was doing something repeatedly illegally in these properties. Somebody decided they needed to do something about it, and then the next thing you know, they grab the guy grabs his gun. The second he grabbed a gun, it's self-defense, he gets shot. So that is actually a narrative that's not telling the whole story. So now, of course, the kid's just a thug or whatever. And then the other side of the story, comes out that there's just a lynching and all of this. Some white guys chase down this black guy, and this is what always happens. And black kids have a particularly high level of risk, and blah blah blah. So the one side saying, well, black people are more often criminals. The other side saying, and so they're just tapping into these things that are kind of true, and then just running with that to create a narrative and to you can see that it's like something's bogus here, where the real story, you try to tell the real story, is very complicated, very difficult to tell. So you can't just point and say, see, another black guy got shot, or see, he was a criminal. It's very easy to just see, there's the one thing, story told. But the real story probably is what I started to tell, and a bit more complicated, is that he was doing whatever he's doing in those properties for whatever reason. It probably, the people who own the property or people who decided they were going to do something, or were aware of it, decided they were going to do something about it, rather than doing what you're supposed to do. Or maybe they even did. They tried to, I don't know if they tried to get the cops involved, but a lot of times the cops won't get involved for low level stuff. They're just a waste of resources. Whatever reason, they decided they're going to take this into their own hands. So you can see, now we have a bad decision happening here. And then they decide to take it into their own hands with guns. And so now, they end up chasing the kid down. And at some point, they pull out their guns and they tell the kid this or that or the other thing. At that point, they've actually violated the law because they're brandishing. It's illegal to point a gun at somebody. So when you get the story, so there's probably all this give and take, in the
Mhm.
story. There's probably this complicated set of events and series of events that led to what actually happened. And that takes a lot of work to explain. That's kind of the key thing here with critical theory, is that takes a lot of work to explain. Where if you instead have this kind of like broad arching narrative, oh, well, white people kill black people because of racism. And then you say, see, here's another example. Or you have this broad arching narrative. Um, Something's wrong with black people and they tend to be criminals. So, oh, he was in that property, there it is. They tend to be violent. He grabbed that guy's gun. And it's like, I don't even know. It's what we were just talking about, the parochial altruism, not looking at the details. Like, how do you not notice that the gun had to be pointed at him first before he grabbed it? Like, that seems relevant. But
Exactly.
so it's very likely that it's causes of things are very difficult to suss out. Figuring out the complete story of something, building a traditional theory of the thing, is actually a lot of work. It's not psychologically satisfying. It does not fit into a partisan narrative of, see, that's the one thing that I needed to communicate, so he was absolutely right or he was absolutely wrong. And that's sort of the thing. And if you inculcate people into thinking that way, and in particular not just in a partisan way, but also into thinking, oh, wow, there are these systems of power that are created by whatever they happen to be created by. And whether it's systemic racism on the one side, whether it is the government, if you look at certain branches of libertarians, if it's that the leftist agenda to basically let criminals get away with stuff or whatever. You can think of different like systems of power that are causing people problems and then spinning a narrative around that. If you inculcate people into thinking that way, the second they see the story, they're just like, ah, there it is. There's proof of this ultimately very simplistic narrative and very vague psychological thing, mind reading type thing, where the person's motivations, the forces, and then you have this, not a prescription to solve the specific problem, but now we're going to change society completely in order to address the problem somehow, because society, the whole system, that's sort of what's at the heart of critical theory. So you could say in this particular story, the right wing wants to be liberated from the oppression of thugs being able to get away with it and people not integrating into society, all these things that they think are bad for society and that are systemic problems that are perpetuated, in this case, by an ethic of multiculturalism, which I kind of agree with them. Multiculturalism is a problem. It doesn't actually work. There are other solutions, pluralism, for example. And then the other side, you have people that are spinning this idea that, oh, systems of power are racism. Everything comes down to how races are treated. And the thing is there's actually grains of truth in both, but neither one is that, here's that word again, perspicacious understanding of what's actually going on that can allow people to find problems to solve. So instead, they just think, oh, well, the system is the problem, and the system therefore needs to be changed, and on we go.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting that. It got me thinking about how people, this narrative thing is powerful. We think best in stories. I
Mm-hmm.
really don't know why, but we do. I think it's because it generates, cause effect relationships very easily. You have heroes. You get a moral layer very easily with a story,
Mm-hmm.
and stories can perpetuate. You can expand on stories. So, or maybe you could look at it as a jigsaw puzzle, and every little piece of confirmatory information is another piece you're putting in your puzzle to create this picture you already know exists.
Right. Then
Because
that's another thing of how we think.
right,
We think in terms of confirmation. We don't think in terms of disconfirmation or falsification. So we're looking for pieces of that. We're looking for puzzle pieces. We know what we know the picture on the box, right? And we're looking for the puzzle pieces that make it come out, rather than we're actually trying to assemble the pieces correctly so that we see what the real picture is.
Precisely.
Yeah, it's there's some serious cognitive bias issues, and one of which being this social identity, parochial altruism, tribalist kind of thinking that my side has to be right, and if the other side gets power or gets the upper hand, then my side gets discredited and my side isn't gonna, so it's bad for the interests of my group at that point. It's it we're unfortunate primates in some
We are,
ways.
aren't we? I mean, you start really examining this and you realize truth ain't got nothing to do with this picture. It is all about perceptions,
And it's so hard. That was ultimately postmodernism, right? And it's
Yeah,
so hard not to fall into that and
right.
think that's all it is. And somebody asked me recently, in fact, how do you recognize that and not fall into postmodernism? And it's literally to reject kind of the one, I mean, it's X-Files, but it's to reject the one thing that Richard Rorty, I think, got most wrong with it is Rorty said it may be that the world is out there, but the truth isn't out there. No, the truth is out there. There is if you just accept that there is a genuine, true story to what happened, and to within certain limits, depending on historically, you can't actually know everything that happened, blah blah blah, but within certain limits that we can actually come to know something about it. There is a truth, and we can know something about it. Then you're not stuck in this. Everything's perception. There's your truth, there's my truth, and that means there's your reality and my reality. I even saw the other day, because on Twitter I got talking about how the social justice side of things hates objectivity. They see it as a myth. And so I even saw somebody saying I ended up mockingly saying it again, is like, there's your objectivity and my objectivity. It's like somebody sent me an email and was like, you don't understand objectivity, because it's like you have your objectivity and I have mine. And it's like, subjective objectivity, you mean? No.
Right.
And so you do have to resist that. You do have to, if you want to stay out of that morass where it just becomes competing narratives, you have to be willing to agree that there is some true thing there is some truth. That truth might be partially or largely discoverable, or at least we can end up agreeing upon some version of events through certain processes that we call, epistemologies or methodologies or whatever. And then we can resolve the conflict in narratives that way. That's all science. That's all liberal processes. That's all liberal law come down to, is good means of conflict resolution between disputing narratives, whether it's a disputing narrative of where undersea basalt is formed. That was the foundation of the science of geology. If you don't know that story, it's kind of funny. Whether it's what actually happened with the particular shooting, whether it's how the court of laws will decide upon a thing using standards like preponderance of evidence or beyond all reasonable doubt, or the reasonable person standard, how would a reasonable person interpret the situation to determine if somebody was acting outside of that. All these different, it's not like we know nothing about how to know stuff. And the postmodern view kind of is that we actually don't know how to know anything, because knowledge is all politics, and it's all assertion of narrative and power, and who has the power decides the narrative. And you can see, coming out of like propaganda and stuff, where that kind of comes from. But there, if you go, I hate it with the X-Files because it's about like freaking aliens and conspiracies. but if you can actually accept the idea that the truth is out there, then that's all it takes to resist postmodernism.
Yep.
And that the truth might not suit your narrative, and that's how you do it. These processes, though, and I think I'm going to die on this hill of saying it. I don't think anybody will kill me for it. I'm just going to keep saying it until I'm dead. Is that science, liberal institutions are conflict resolution systems. They're not necessarily perfect. They're pretty good. And their point is to resolve conflict when you have two narratives that don't match. I can tell you that science of geology, people recognize geology is a science. So you have, what was it? Lyell was the guy who founded the science of geology officially by resolving a conflict. So the conflict in geology, I think this was like early 19th century, but I don't remember for sure the dates. And the conflict was, so we'll put this in a story so people can remember it.
Right.
Where does oceanic basalt come from? Basalt is a rock.
Mm.
Okay, it's a type of rock. The question was, where does it come from? And there were these, how come there's so much basalt on the seafloor? And there were two competing stories or claims about where it came from, two camps of thought. One were the it's one were the Vulcans or the Vulcanists, and one were the Neptunians. And it sounds like something ridiculous.
Really?
But if you actually understand the words, they're just
Right.
referring back to the different Greek gods. Are those no? Those are Roman gods, right? Vulcan and Neptune are Roman.
I believe. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, Roman gods. And so Vulcan means volcanoes, and Neptune means sea. So the two hypotheses, if you want to simmer it down or boil it down, were it comes from undersea volcanoes, which turned out to be correct,
Mm.
or it comes from something, the sea itself, like precipitates some kind of mineral that becomes the rock on the bottom.
Mhm.
Which these aren't, calling that the Neptunian view sounds like just funny, but
Right.
it turns out not to be
Too.
insane. And so they didn't have science in geology at the time. So the way that they settled this crap was by just getting in fights, like arguments. They'd get in these rooms and they'd just yell at each other. They'd call each other names. It was cancel culture. Literally, there was a story involved where one of the scientists' wife or something wrote a play, or maybe he wrote a play. Somebody wrote a play. And so they performed the play, has nothing to do with the science at all. It's just a play being performed in a playhouse. And the other camp, all of them showed up and were like booing and like throwing tomatoes to like cancel the play because it was put forth by one of the people on the other side. It's insane. And this was geology. This was a science that hadn't been born yet.
This is
right, over rocks.
Rocks.
Over rocks.
Yeah, get it, folks. Right? People are showing up and trying to ruin other people's work and livelihood and lives over rocks.
Over a disagreement, an unresolvable disagreement about where certain types of rock came from. And so this Lyle comes up with this brilliant idea that they're going to settle this. This got hot. It was like bad. And so he was like, we're going to solve this. So he pulls together like a council of people who are like, we've had enough of the fighting. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a pact. And the deal was that they were going to get this, go look at rocks.
What?
And they were going to figure it out. And may the best team win, but we're going to actually go look at rocks and figure it out. And that's how geology became a science. And it's a really great story for understanding that there are bad conflict resolution methods, like cancel culture and showing up and yelling at people and getting in fights, sometimes verbal, sometimes physical, because you can't resolve the conflict in your two narratives. You have two narratives, can't resolve the conflict. So fighting is a bad conflict resolution. And then there are better ones, like let's defer to external reality. That's called falsification. Or let's work out the logic of it. Now, this is a good example because you had basically science was natural philosophy at the time. Mm-hmm. So you had two philosophically sound accounts, but you couldn't resolve them. Philosophy didn't have the tools necessary to resolve them. You actually needed falsification. You had to go look at reality to determine it. And so science, liberalism are institutions of law, not perfect, but they are very good actually already. Conflict resolution methods. Nobody now is going to get at arms about, like, say there's some chemical that's been discovered or something, and it's like, what do we do? Nobody starts like setting people on fire or they're burning down their play or whatever. They just go to the lab. We've now got a conflict resolution method. Like, let's actually just go do a test on this thing. Let's figure it out. Except in certain areas of science. Except in certain areas of science. So you do actually see this now in science about racial disparities, having to do with, say, police violence. You see this in science having to do with gender identity, transgender issues, rather tremendously. Decent science, like you're not even allowed to look into the question of a concept called rapid onset gender dysphoria. Is there a social contagion effect happening in young people leading them to want to transition more often? Or is there a similar thing happening where, good progressive parents are convincing their kids that they should be trans? Are there social elements like this that you can't even study it? You're not, people will try to destroy your livelihood. They'll try to destroy your career. They will try to get, if the journals publish it, they'll try to get the journal destroyed, the editors fired. I mean, it's some serious, serious throwback to a bad conflict resolution method that we've spent the last literally like 400 years figuring out that good conflict resolution method. You see it in law. I saw a paper recently talking about around the COVID-19 pandemic, saying that it turns out to be legal to triage within disability law. It is legal to triage around disability. It's a valid question right now. Like, can we do this? Should we do this? Is it allowed? What are the parameters? What are the ethical considerations? It's a valid question when you actually do have to consider medical triage on a large scale. And it turns out that somebody publishes a paper in like the Yale Law Journal or something like that. Like, we're not talking some silly little corner journal, and says, it does fall within the confines of disability law to triage. And the reaction was a petition to get the paper retracted and possibly punish the author and so on. So we have good conflict resolution methods, which would be, write your own paper, criticize in detail where it went wrong, where the logic is wrong, where the law says this or that, maybe invoke a reasonable person standard. What would a reasonable person do if they had to make this kind of decision? What are the different parameters on an ethical? I mean, there's a lot there in a traditional theory approach. And then there's this, no, let's just yell it out of the universe. Bad conflict resolution. And that's the thing, is critical theories don't have a good conflict resolution mechanism. Traditional theories have a good conflict resolution mechanism.
Right.
So it's some like kind of like the simplest, what are the nuts and what are the bolts of this thing? That's what's going on, is conflict resolution methods for battling narratives, and how do we resolve one to another.
It's interesting. It's a great framing of that. I like that framing. I think of a lot of the, when we talked about that cycle of becoming part of a group, leaving a group, other people then, learning about how bad the group is by people who used to be in it. That certainly has value. I'm looking at it from a particular angle here,
yeah,
of criticizing this cycle that occurs, that we humans perpetuate. This is
right.
how ideas are forwarded, challenged, and changed over time, by the way. This is the cycle. It seems kind of obvious once we lay it all out. But it's interesting how the people who get on board tend to get on board of the social movements that we're talking about based almost purely on emotion or moral reasons, right? Well, it's just wrong.
It's gross.
Because you're oppressing people, right? And so anything that even moves in the flavor of any kind of criticism or critical analysis of a belief or an action or a policy, should we be moving forward? How do we triage, et cetera, for example, becomes a moral question, when in fact that wasn't really how we were looking at this at all.
Right.
I'm sure when you do a legal analysis, some kind of a study of how is this played out, how should it play out, what would be the cost benefit analysis. I mean, there's all kinds of resource computations you could do when it comes to medical practice, especially now. I'm sure a lot of those computations are being done. But the backlash that you describe, I'm positive, is not based on what you just, as you said,
correct,
should be based on fact this, fact this, fact this. Instead, it's just, no, that's wrong because it's immoral.
Because it can perpetuate oppression.
Right. Because it could perpetuate oppression.
And that is key. Could.
Exactly.
And it's not even just could. It's could be construed to possibly perpetuate oppression.
Is the analysis of this really suffers because those computations aren't done. For example, you can easily lay out why Germany has anti-swastika laws. There is zero question about that. Nobody has a moral problem with that. At least nobody who's really got their wits around why they would have such a law. We know how easy it is to rile up a nation of people, and not just Germans. I'm not picking on Germans. I'm just using them as an example here
Sure.
of like, why would you not want to allow swastikas in public again? Kind of sensible. You go, okay, I get it. I get where these guys are at. The trauma has not even come close to being played out in that country yet. And it's 100 years later. Doesn't matter. It's probably going to take another 5 generations before somebody's going to seriously think about showing a swastika in a public forum of some kind in Germany. It's going to take a lot more time. There's very good historical accurate reasons for that.
Right.
So the arguments there are not just moral arguments of it doesn't make me feel good or it makes me feel bad. But this, I only throw that out there to sort of give some kind of analogous sort of thing that you could look at and go, well, that's a moral thing. Well, not totally. This kind of is. This is just, it's just wrong, And again, it has to do with these stories we tell ourselves,
Right. That strikes again to the heart of the difference between the traditional methods and the critical methods.
Right.
Because and I just figured this out recently, and it's like in a watershed moment. So I haven't really talked much about it publicly yet. Traditional theories use tools like defeasibility. That's a technical philosophy term. Like, is something, some idea contradictory? Is there some other idea that's likely to be true that's contradictory to the thing that would defeat it? Is it logically invalid? Are the premises sound or not sound? So there are different ways that you can defeat a philosophical argument. Science uses falsification. They bounce it off of experiment, and if it's falsified, well, even if it's logically valid, fine, but it doesn't match reality, so it's been falsified. Karl Popper outlined that idea. And then critical theory uses problematization. It says, is it problematic? And what does problematic mean? Problematic means, can it possibly perpetuate oppression? And or be understood to? A great example, by the way, of the can it possibly be construed to is I saw recently there's a thing that floated around on Twitter the other day where somebody tweeted that somebody told them the real reason why they're called master bedrooms, and they'll never be okay again. And I mean, you immediately pick up that it's where the master slept versus the slave quarters, right? So it can be, so now master bedroom is a problem, and it's got to be called the main bedroom or something like that because it perpetuates thoughts of slavery and so on. Okay, now hold on. The question is that, I saw this and I was like, fine.
Sorry, that's just classic.
So then somebody comes to me, I tweeted about it, and somebody comes to me and sends me an article that's where it was written before any of this hot take bullcrap. What's the actual history of calling it the master bathroom or bedroom? Bathroom would apply too. And it turns out that the term never appears anywhere before like a Sears catalog in 1928, which means it probably doesn't have anything to do with slavery whatsoever. It has this whole other history. And so that doesn't matter. The idea is that calling it the master bedroom could make people who've been now trained to think about slavery's relevance to everything, it could make those people think about slave quarters versus the master's quarters. And so now it doesn't matter. The term is problematic even if the history doesn't match up with the claim being made. So they're actually allowed to be wrong about the term because that doesn't matter, because the problematic still exists even regardless of the history, because people will think that. It's like my colleague, Helen Pluckrose, when she wrote about when she was doing her master's degree, she had this case where she wrote a paper and claimed in it that one of the best ways to overcome racism has something to do with developing a sense of shared goals in racially diverse groups, because you fixate on the goal rather than on social factors, and everybody kind of comes together to solve the problem, and you form bonds and so on. And she was told that the science might be correct, but that she shouldn't rely upon that, because think of how problematic it would be if an African American were to read it, and it was, keep in mind, she's British, so it was, what if a Black American reads this and finds it uncomfortable to say that there's a way to overcome racism. So this is problematic. So we can't include it. So it doesn't even matter whether the thing is true or not. All that matters, it's genuinely, and I know this is some high order philosophy shit, but it's genuinely a completely different epistemology that they're using. They vet which ideas are valid and not valid. True and false don't matter. So you can't even say which ideas are true and which ideas are false. They vet which ideas are valid and invalid based upon whether they're potentially problematic in any way whatsoever. And if they're potentially problematic, then they are not acceptable. Doesn't matter if they're true or false. And that's the heart of critical theory. And that is like literally the beating heart of the whole methodology. And you can see why when it gets decoupled from having to care whether about things are true or not, it starts to be a big problem real fast. And that's actually what's happening. Yeah, I know we're not really doing a great job of talking about woke, but within the so-called woke movement, or the critical social justice movement, as I have taken from their literature and named it, that is exactly how they think about everything. True and false don't matter. It's only whether or not it could potentially be problematic. And if it is, we have to have wide or large scale change. There has to be a large scale societal change, our knowledge systems, our institutions, our ways of speaking. So we need politically correct language, our teaching, our everything, our cultural mores, our values, our morals, all have to change around the thing that could be problematic. And as you said, they come at it with like, it's gross. Right. It's bad. It's on the wrong side of history.
Right. And tailoring an entire society around a small group of people's morality has pretty much been the recipe for disaster in every history book we've ever written.
Oh, yeah. And especially when you include, we're not even going to bother trying to figure out if things are true or false in society anymore. We're just going to cater to, and we're going to try to very carefully circle around, back to and around, and not too close to the fact that this might really have a lot to do with like trauma informed thinking. Yeah. So trying to cater society around people who are psychologically broken.
That's right.
I'll get in a lot of trouble for calling them psychologically broken. And I don't think they all are, of course, but there are a lot of people at the core of this that have some serious psychological issues going on, and their philosophy seems to be an attempt to work that out. As Nietzsche said, most philosophy turns out to be anyway.
Exactly.
I mean, you can just think of lots of examples where you have within like feminism, you have people who are worried about the trauma associated with people who have been raped. That's a real trauma. That's a freaking thing. And so now we have to completely reorder society, getting rid of due process, getting rid of many of the fundamental principles of law that make a liberal society work, in order that no person who's had that trauma or who could imagine having that trauma is made to feel uncomfortable in that way ever. And then you get like trigger warnings and all of this, the rest of this stuff. And then you can look at it within like the context of race, where we can't use words like master bathroom or master bedroom anymore, because it might make somebody think of slavery. And then, I mean, you can even look though at the theorists. Like Robin DiAngelo is very famous. She wrote White Fragility, New York Times bestseller for 6 months, world speaking tour for 2 years. She's written a number of education books. She's a critical whiteness educator is her kind of thing. Critical whiteness studies is a subject. And Robin DiAngelo, if you read in White Fragility, I think it's a fabulous read. It's like when I used to be an atheist and I am still an atheist, but I used to tell people, you just go read the Bible. you want to know why I'm an atheist? Go actually read your Bible. Yeah. See what's in there for the first time. Yeah. Beyond the 200 things your pastor says. In that favorite quote of Benjamin Franklin, attributed to Benjamin Franklin, probably wrongly, that God helps those who help themselves. It turns out that one's not in there. You'll be surprised what you find. But it's like, I just tell people, what should they say? They say, what should I read to kind of get a grip on what this is, go read White Fragility. Actually, go read it. Take a look. And so there's this scene in there. This is one of my favorite questions to ask people is, they talk about this stuff, and I'm like, well, you should read White Fragility. And they're like, oh, I read White Fragility. And I don't say, what did you think of the book? I say, well, what do you think of the particular scene that she relays where she shows up at the park to a potluck for work? And there are two parties happening at the park, one of which is her work party, and one of which turns out to be maybe a family reunion, whatever it is. It's all Black people. And she relays in the book that she absolutely freaks out that she might have to be in a group of all Black people. And it's like, the woman's racist. It's like, she's just freaking out. She knows she's not supposed to be. She knows it's bad. And there's a psychological disorder called scrupulosity. It's very common in some strict religious upbringings. Catholics and Mormons have it particularly. It's scrupulosity about racism. Her whole anti-racist project, her whole white fragility thing, the whole freaking thing, this white complicity, all of these concepts, they are scrupulosity about racism. It is people who see race like maybe people do, and then they think, I'm not supposed to see race. I'm a bad person. I bet I'm racist. I must have implicit biases. Oh, no. And then they freak out and go write a blog, or in this case, a book, talking about how bad racism is and how white people are all complicit in it. It's kind of like this joke I saw when I was one of the funniest damn things I think I ever saw, like nerd joke. And somehow it was like a comic, and it showed Sigmund Freud, and it was like showing him sitting there thinking, and it was like, no, it's not just that I want to have sex with my mother. Everybody wants to have sex with their mothers.
Right. That's the fatal flaw in the logic right there. And it is perhaps the most devastating case of projection in a modern society that we have seen.
Right.
Because you have somebody who's a racist, and they go, well, shit, I'm a nice, good, whole, well-reared, well-educated white person. So if I feel this way deep, dark inside myself, then everybody must think this too. Because how could I be so good and still be so bad? Exactly. And
there's actually a term for that in their literature.
Really?
It's called good white.
Ah.
They call it. So one of the fake papers that we wrote was a rewrite, not of a particular chapter of Mein Kampf, but what actually had happened was, to tell a story as briefly as possible, Peter took a digital copy of Mein Kampf, searched for the word Jew, and then just selected in order, going through the text, a number of paragraphs till he got to the right number of words that are all like railing on Jews. Turns out the book's full of that. And
surprise.
Yeah. And so that wasn't like, when we say that, that was from Mein Kampf, it wasn't like specifically, chapter 4 or something like that. It was just a smattering throughout in order, where he's attacking Jews consistently, and we replaced Jew with white person. And so then we ended up writing that paper up and doing the whole thing, and we wrote it as a first-person narrative. They call that an autoethnography. And we wrote it as a first-person narrative of a white lesbian who discovers her whiteness and becomes very upset with herself over it, sort of like Robin DiAngelo. And one of the reasons, now the paper was bad, so I'm not going to say it was the reason it got rejected, but one of the reasons the peer reviewers cited for rejecting it was that it positions the author as a good white. It positions the author as somebody who gets it about racism, which makes her a good white, and therefore that's not been sufficiently problematized. And so that's where I first realized good white is a term. And I was like, holy crap. And so if you really, again, I recommend people read White Fragility, but if you really want to have a fun read, there's a book that came out 2018 or 19, I can't remember, by Shannon Sullivan. Shannon Sullivan is not a small name. She's not like a household-ish name like Robin DiAngelo, but she's not a small name in this woke project. And she wrote a book called Good White People. Turns out their literature actually fixates on good white people a lot. You can see these kind of scrupulous, we started calling them gender and race nuns early on. They have this very nunnish quality to them. Alison Bailey is one, Robin DiAngelo's one, Barbara Applebaum is one. And if you watch them talk, their manner, the way they do, it's very nunnish. And it's scrupulosity is what's happening, is why. And so anyway, Good White People is the most like vigorous, angry screed about white people who try to be progressive and believe that they're not racist and therefore are perpetuating racism without even being willing to realize it. And they only try to be anti-racist to pretend that they're not racist. And it's like, holy shit, they're mad at these people. It is self-loathing projected outward. It's so obvious when you read. It's clear in White Fragility, but when you read it in Good White People, which bigger author but sort of a fringe book, it's not one of their central canon books, it's just like, holy moly, this is what's going on here. I mean, this is a big piece of what's going on here. So it's the projection of people who don't know how to deal with the fact that they know being racist is bad, and they detect elements of it in themselves. The implicit bias test made that run wild. People all of a sudden all over the place discovered, good white people discovered that they have these racial biases, and they start flipping out. And then the critical theorists were like, see, you have hidden, systems of power. That's how they work. They're hidden inside you with your biases and your assumptions. And it's just like, holy crap, the whole thing caught fire. But definitely you can see it's like, as Mike Nana, the guy that's doing the film about our project, puts it, is like we're being forced to live in other people's pathologies.
Exactly. What comes to mind right now is the Scarlet Letter.
Yeah.
That's
what that was too, right?
That's what the time. That's right.
That technically wasn't witches. That was adultery.
No, that was adultery. But it was guilt.
Exactly.
There's this minister, right, railing and railing and railing for years about sin, and he's the most guilty one.
Exactly. Yeah.
And he's reminded of it every day of the week by this woman walking around with a Scarlet Letter on her chest because she has to, right? So that, which just perpetuates his own guilt and self-loathing, and he's beaten on himself in private, etc. It just makes me think of that as one of.
It is. These same kinds of motives showed up in these, kind of faith traditions gone awry. And you're seeing it again here, and it's this outward projection of not knowing how to deal with the fact that they feel complicit in evil. I mean, that's the whole point of Barbara Applebaum's body of literature. It's called White Complicity. She wrote in 2010 this book called Being Good, Being White, and it's about white complicity. Wow. And it's like deep, interesting, well-written philosophy. I mean, it's proper philosophy at 200 some odd pages long, basically trying to make the case that every white person is complicit in racism, whether they want to be or not. And so it's like stretching and playing like Plato, stretching or silly putty with the definition of complicity to stretch it so that every white person is always complicit in white supremacy and systems of racism.
Interesting outgrowth of this whole thing. I was thinking on there's different levels that we can look at this at. We've gone very personal on this, on the psychological levels of this with the mainline proponents or activists that we see in the critical race theory stuff. I imagine we could talk and name drop the same things or similar. I don't want to say it's all the same as the same as the same. Everybody's got differences and similarities. But I'm sure in other critical theory, groups, we could find similarities there. I step back a second and sociologically or sort of historically look at this and I go, okay, we call it postmodernism. It seems to be an effort to push back to Stone Age thinking.
It is. Yeah, absolutely.
Magical thinking. There's no real truth. It's just how you feel. I mean, how do you think people governed back in the day? Like way back before Enlightenment happened, right? Divinity of kings. It was family lines. It was God who told you to do it. I mean, the Pope and all that. I mean, talk about arbitrary decision making.
Right.
Talk about like moral fluidity and relativism, and you never know what you were going to get, and country by country, it was different. You run around in Gaul, it's quite different from Rome and this kind of thing. But it's all relative. It's all based on, whatever the local culture and religion and ideas were versus any real objective standard of truth. And that's what the Enlightenment gave us, was the ability finally to, here's a method that we can establish falsification. And we find
Right.
this tends to reflect what we refer to and call and think of as objective reality, best as we can perceive it.
Right.
You know,
And that also the belief in human rationality, because that's
right.
where you start getting a lot of it in law.
Yeah.
So that's why objectivity is something we can approximate through the scientific method. That's why we can have something like a reasonable person standard in law, is because we can view people as rational actors and so on. Now, of course, that does need to be nuanced in light of the psychology that we've discovered. Humans are not by default rational actors, and somehow we've got to figure out how to account for that.
Yep.
But humans can be rational actors. And so postmodernism rejects the idea of the can be. I actually think that the outline of what's going on was in Kahneman's very famous book, Thinking Fast and Thinking
Right.
Slow.
Right.
Or Thinking Fast and Slow, maybe just Thinking Fast and Slow.
Fast and slow, I think. Yeah. System two thinking.
Yeah, exactly. So you have intuitive thinking, which is the fast thinking, and that's what we do for navigating most of reality and most of our experience, and social reality in particular, because the calculations are too high or too difficult. Probably part of why autism is what it is because it's harder. They're less intuitive in that regard and have to do more of the calculation, and it's freaking hard to calculate correctly. So they pick the wrong emotion to express in certain times or whatever. Then you have thinking slow, and that's being rational.
Mm-hmm.
And humans, to at least whatever the limits of their cognitive capacity happen to be, are actually capable of sitting down, stopping, thinking through a thing. And even more importantly, they're able to do this socially as well. They're able to say, let's think through this together. Let's have a dialogue. Let's do the dialectical process. Let's figure out the flaws in our thinking, the feasibility, or eventually let's go look at the rocks. Let's do the experiment. So let's add in falsification. So we ended up developing these concepts that really, again, allowed us to resolve conflict. And then postmodernism was like, nope, all an illusion. Let's go back, as you said, essentially to, magical thinking, lived experience, and one's interpretation of that. The idea being to find liberation. Michel Foucault's whole thing was like, let's explore potentialities of being. Makes sense. He was, gay and not allowed to be gay. His dad told him he had to be a doctor. He didn't want to be a doctor. So he had all this constraint on his, his being. So he wants to explore broader potentialities of being. And so he's trying to look, the whole goal of that project becomes to think about things in ways that break down the assumptions that hold us back, to achieve liberation by thinking more expansively. And so that's sort of like the lived experience thing. It's like, well, society tells you this is what your experience means, but you can explore bigger potentialities for yourself, and you get this kind of almost narcissistic, solipsistic thinking. It's all navel gazing in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that all kind of comes out of it. And then you have Jean-Francois Lyotard, who was, we need to reject the meta narrative, these kind of, it depends on how you want to characterize them. I think that social mythology is a good way to do it, but he included science as a meta narrative, which means it has to be like entire like ways of thinking that lots of people can agree upon. That is what he had to have meant by meta narrative. And so he was like, we're going to be skeptical of those in the extreme. And he then, in the book The Postmodern Condition, talks about how it's important to favor local or mini narratives, which again, that's your kind of like tribal thing. So we want to kind of pull back to something we were mentioning earlier. You get on the internet, and now it's almost like countries don't have to be geographically defined. I think about this all the time. Like the internet defines like a whole different version of the world. And so you kind of get like, Foucault talked about regimes of truth. It's almost like those become countries,
right?
On the internet, and they're warring from one another. The weird part is, though, that at the end of the day, they do have to interface back with reality somehow, right? Because people still live in reality, regardless of how much time they spend online.
That's right, and it is a faux virtual reality. It's an interesting thing because it's real. It's certainly real, and ideas are certainly real, but it's also illusory. It's a very strange thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've set some baselines and some ideas here that I want to that actually do have everything to do with wokeness, being woke.
Correct.
And I think now I'd like to just sort of take a little bit of time as we wrap this up here to look at how woke evolved and died as a term. And it's actually kind of demonstrative when you look at the whole history of it, of how this movement is kind of undoing what it's trying to do. It's kind of making it worse rather than making it better. And actually this word kind of demonstrates that. And it was only after we talked about all this that I saw that so clearly. I didn't come into this thinking that. But if we go back to the history of where it comes from, it goes back to, at least as far as people have been able to trace it, as it shows up in Wikipedia and various media articles. Oxford dictionaries record it as 1962 article from the New York Times, "If You're Woke, You Dig It," by William Melvin Kelly. And in a 1971 play, Garvey Lives, by a guy named Barry Beckham. And it's, quote, "I have been sleeping all my life, and now that Mr. Garvey done woke me up, I'm going to stay woke. And I'm going to help him wake up other black folk." And I'm just reading what it says here. I'm not trying to do some stupid accent. Wake up Ethiopia, wake up Africa. This was a black thing, and it was a black, a word, and this is how it was used. This is how it was defined. Let me tell you, buddy, waking up is a damn sight harder than going to sleep, but we'll stay woke up longer. Another quote from African American United Mine Workers in 1940. That's where that came from. So we get this like, hey, this is clearly a precursor to the entire civil rights movement, or part of that whole activity, which blew up in the 50s and 60s. And good for them. Good on them. This was a wonderful thing to have happen. Civil rights are very, very necessary for, a progressive society. So that happens. Then these folks come along, right? The critical race theory folks.
Right.
And so you get then come up into the 2000s to stay woke.
Right. Erykah Badu.
Yeah, being aware. That's right. Being aware. He used it. Rapper Badu began to use woke and stay woke in connection to social and racial justice issues. That was 2012. And the hashtag stay woke emerged as a widely used thing. There was
with Black Lives Matter,
yeah, and Black Lives Matter, exactly.
So it was stay woke to the fact that police aren't treating you, so you got to be aware, etc. So it became big in Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is the thing that mainstreamed critical race theory, because it started to say that, look, there must be this systemic and institutional racism throughout our whole society.
That's right. And if you didn't want to be a racist, and you had this, right? I'm pointing to my white skin here. If you didn't want to be perceived as a bad person, then you wanted to go along with that. Because who doesn't want equal rights? Who doesn't want civil rights for everybody? Who doesn't want an equal playing field and equality of opportunity and that sort of thing? But that was only the veneer to get you on board.
Right.
That's the problem with that, is it was a false front. It was a false flag operation, if you will. Because then it morphed, as words will do. It morphed, and by the late 2010s, woke had taken to indicate, quote, healthy paranoia, especially about issues of racial and political justice. Healthy paranoia, that's an interesting term, isn't it? Healthy paranoia, and has been adopted as a more generic slang term and has been the subject of memes. And this is only in the last 10 years. So, and then here's how the movement kind of eats itself a little bit. In the New York Times Magazine, Amanda Hess raised concerns that the word had been culturally appropriated.
Because it's problematic. That's all they do is find problematics.
That's right. So
and everything's problematic.
When white people aspire to get points for consciousness, they walk right into the crosshairs between allyship and appropriation.
Yep, they did that with people of color also. People of color is now being alleged to be used by white people so they can ignore the differences between different races
Right.
that are not white, because they see not white as all one thing, and worse. Very Derrida.
Oh my God. Well, let me go to this, and then I will ask you what you think about all this, because I find it fascinating personally, because then we come full circle. Former President Barack Obama, a black man, by the way, need we remind everybody of that, points out that the left's woke culture is eyes wide open to everyone else's political sins. This is from a Washington Examiner article. Essentially, woke on the left has become conformity to a political dogma, and may God help you if you're still asleep. And then here's how Obama put it. Quote, this idea of purity, and you're never compromised, and you're always politically woke and all that stuff, you should get over that quickly. The world is messy. There are ambiguities. Like if I tweet or hashtag about how you didn't do something right or use the word wrong verb, then I can sit back and feel pretty good about myself, because, man, did you see how woke I was? I called you out. That's a direct quote from Barack Obama. So we've come within a century of this word coming up, being used in a positive, useful way for civil rights, to the very people that it was meant to help, saying, the president, right, saying, this has gotten so out of hand, it's so ridiculous that could we please just stop? Mm-hmm. And I find that evolution fascinating, only because of all the things we've been talking about this whole podcast.
Yeah, and it's. I mean, I don't know if you know what happened to Obama with among the woke for doing that, which is they're like, oh, he's conservative.
Yep,
he's a conservative.
Of course he was.
He's alt-right, probably.
Isn't that hilarious how fast they turn?
They have no loyalty except to the ideology,
right?
Which is why they're famous for eating themselves, or eating. I like to say intersectionality chews on its own leg, but
there you go.
This is a funny image in my mind. But yeah, I mean, the key thing here is that there was critical race theory. It's very interesting that in the late 1990s, critical race theory actually arose in law, in critical legal studies by two lawyers, Derek Bell, who's at Harvard Law, and his PhD student, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's much more famous for having invented intersectionality as a concept.
Oh, right.
So she and her mentor, Derek Bell, are considered the progenitors of critical race theory. Obama, it turns out, was quite well learned and highly supportive of critical race theory. In the late 90s, there were tons of strong criticisms in law journals of critical race theory, and all of them recognize the same thing. It's very odd that there's so much activity with this in the academy, but it's never left legal theory. It's never gone anywhere. Nobody in the public pays attention to it. It's not affecting law very much at all. It's, why is this happening? And here are all of the flaws in the way that it thinks. And then roughly around 2000, all such criticisms vanish. Nobody's publishing that stuff anymore. It's really kind of bizarre. There was this huge spate of criticisms. So it turns out that we have to kind of take 2 seconds to think about why Derek Bell and we've been talking about critical theory for a while now, so we have some idea of what the problem with critical race theory is. It's critical theory. But one of the key things about critical race theory, I guess two of the key things, one of them is that it views racism in American society, and it does usually specifically say that, as permanent and ordinary, which means that it's something that's just beneath the surface. It's always there. You just scratch the surface and racism will bubble out. It operates systemically and so on. It's anti-liberal in that fact. It believes that liberalism upholds that systemic racism. But a second thing is, and this is a concept of Derek Bell's, it's very much at the heart of it, and it explains a little bit of what we were just saying, is interest convergence. So one of Derek Bell's ideas was the interest convergence thesis. And the interest convergence thesis says that white folks only go along with things that help black folks when it's in the white people's interest too. So the interests have to converge. They never, in general, it's nobody in a position of dominance will give the oppressed their rights. They only do it when it's to their own advantage. So there's your healthy paranoia, right? So the question that Robin DiAngelo writes about all the time is it's when you look at a public policy, when you look at science, when you look at a way of knowing, whatever it happens to be, you always have to ask, and I think she says this specifically in one of her books about objectivity, is, whose interests does objectivity serve? And the implication, of course, is dominant groups: white, Western, masculinist, straight, able-bodied, fit and thin, so on and so forth, healthy. You can start listing all the things that Judith Butler described when you have to do all these lists as that, exasperated, etc. When you try to list all the identity categories that you have to pay attention to and intersectionality every time. And so you have this concept of interest convergence that then going forward, as critical race theory starts to mainstream, starts to view any progress that's happened since even the civil rights movements, Derek Bell construed as only having been done because it was in white people's interests more than in black people's interests. So it was just another way to oppress black people, and went further and said that it just opened up a whole can of new worms for black people to have to deal with, because now they have to participate equally in society, and the society doesn't value them equally, or whatever it is. They have to go to integrated schools that are no longer segregated, and that means they get better schools, but they have to experience racism at school now. And it's like this whole like crazy mentality that progress isn't progress. And so you wonder why it undoes everything that it tries to accomplish, is because it has this mentality that progress isn't progress, literally at its core.
Wow, man. I thought,
and that's
I
even without
just heard it all. I thought I had gone as down deep as it would get, and I'd not heard that.
No, it's really bad. And so it's very interesting, that Obama saying this woke thing is like, get over that. Because for a while, he actually, I don't know if he was a student of Bell's. I don't think he was, but he definitely taught Derek Bell's material. And he definitely, he's famously quoted, the right parades this quote around like crazy now, that he had quoted saying that, one of the most important thinkers, Derek Bell, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, so,
well, it looks like he changed his mind at some point along the way, which he has the perfect right to do.
Right, because what he said is absolutely true. Life is messy. The world is messy. There's ambiguity. Things are difficult, and then there's this whole like, I owned you online, so-and-so destroys,
right.
We won't name so-and-sos, so-and-so destroys with facts and logic or whatever online. So you use the wrong word, you called it a master bedroom, you racist. And so it's just, this whole mentality of just critical theory rather than a perspicacious traditional theory has now come into the fore in terms of racial analysis. And it's been so successful at bullying other research off the table that it's now considered to be the only valid research on race. These are race scholars, and in some places they get called race sociologists. So they get promoted to a level of science when they say that science is bad and wrong, that they don't deserve. So, there's a lot going on there. It also, by the way, when we say that it undoes what it does, it's not just a healthy paranoia. It literally gets the entire program backwards.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about Helen saying that shared goals in a diverse group, meaning just identity diverse group, not what they mean by diversity, which is its own can of worms, actually can overcome racism. Well, according to critical race theory, nothing can overcome racism, so that can't be true. So now we have to problematize that. But the core thing that they decided to do, and this was very much Kimberly Crenshaw in the literature, but she built off of bell hooks and the other black feminists, and the black feminists were, guess what they were, if I said critical theorists, in the so-called New Left that followed straight out of Herbert Marcuse, who was one of the big-time guys, came to Columbia University from the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, So you can draw the line, drawing the line is it's a very straight line. There aren't very many curves here. The Black feminism picked up critical theory. Black feminism started talking about this need to identify as Black rather than a person who happens to be Black. We're going to get rid of color blindness. We're going to make race salient. We're going to make race the most salient and most important thing. And it turns out that basically everything we actually know about race and racism is that increases it, and doing the opposite decreases it. Yeah. So, but they say that that's absolutely critical. So at the very heart, again, of critical race theory is what they call an identity first model of doing identity politics, frankly, which is that you put your identity first. So I am a Black person, Kimberly Crenshaw writes in Mapping the Margins, her most famous paper from 1991. She writes, I am a Black person means more than I am a person that happens to be Black. And it is an important kind of more that's crucial for identity politics. So now you see this everywhere. I'm not a person who happens to have lost my hearing. I am a deaf person, capital D, deaf person. I am a capital B, Black person. Why do they capitalize the Black, by the way? The B in Black. That's why, because they have to, and I will actually say, reify the socially constructed racial category. And now here's where it gets funny. Their point is to destroy the meaning in the socially constructed racial category if you ask them, but they are trying to do it by forwarding that meaning explicitly every single time. It's like, how are you going to get rid of the thing by bringing it up over and over and over again? So when you talk about getting things exactly backwards and how they actually harm the efforts that they're trying to achieve, that efforts that most of us, whatever our race, most of us in society would actually agree with. You ask even all but a small percentage of the craziest conservative type people, the ones who aren't even really, the conservatives won't even claim them. They're just racist. You ask everybody else, would you like to get society to be less racist? Yes. Would you like to be less racist? Yes. Do you think racism it should have an impact on people's opportunities? No. Everybody, basically, outside of a very tiny fringe minority, agrees with this. And yet, the one way that we know of, or the set of ways that we know of that actually can achieve that, are problematized because they possibly, if you want to know why I say color blindness is problematized, is because it's possible that color blindness leads to racism blindness, which is a denial that racism is still a thing. I'm not racist. There is no racism. We're all colorblind now. That's called racism blindness. So because color blindness can lead to, not always does, can lead to racism blindness, color blindness is problematic and color blindness has to go. Therefore, we have to assert, I'm on team Black, I'm on team white, I'm on team, and then you're like, holy shit, don't do that. Everybody. And how crazy is it is that these identities aren't even who you are, they're political. So Kanye West puts on a MAGA hat, and Kanye West is declared in an article published somewhere to be, quote, no longer Black.
Right.
Because he has white politics now.
Right. So it becomes an ideological identity.
It's a nightmare.
I'll tell you, we sit here and we wonder why we're so divided as a nation, and I'm pretty sure I'm on fairly stable ground when I say that this is predominantly an American phenomenon. I'm positive it's spread around to other countries.
Critical race theory is predominantly American, but the critical method is strong in both Europe and America, or also Canada and Australia, throughout the English-speaking world, frankly.
Fair enough. Well, of course, and it's derived from, the postmodernism, which is not American in
right. Post-colonial aspects are much stronger once you get out of the U.S. context.
Okay.
Yeah, they're obsessed with the everything's decolonize this and decolonize that. So it's colonial guilt versus race guilt.
Because they were all the ones doing the colonizing.
Correct.
We were the ones who brought all the slaves over and, built the South on it. So makes sense. I totally get that. But if you're looking for, with what we've broken down here, with what we have deconstructed, it seems that it's pretty clear where a lot of this national divisiveness is coming from. And or it's certainly a major component of it, and it is ideological in nature, as we have shown. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not, you can't divorce this stuff from politics. And this is one of the bugbears of me on my channel, is I've gone from cults to extremist thinking to politics, where it is most obvious. It is the easiest way to talk about extremism, is to point it out in politics, and yet it's the hardest place to point it out and talk about it, because people are so divided, they're not willing to objectively hear what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally like I start going into what I was just doing. I start getting stressed out, and I'm thinking it's like the house is on fire. It's not like the dog, like this is fine. It's like, if in this case it would be the left, but it depends, because if the same things are happening on the right as well, but in
Mm-hmm.
a different way. So on the left, you're like, this house is on fire. We're throwing gasoline on it, in fact, and they're like, no, it's not fire. There's no flames. There's no flames. On the right, what I always hear, I talk about how Trump is deconstructing the office of the president, and that it's basically critical government studies. And then the comeback I get from them is, well, it needed to be deconstructed. And it's like, whoa,
Mm-hmm.
we're in a bad place.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, on the one side you got people on some sides you got people embracing the flame. And then on the other sides you got people saying, well, no, the flames aren't really flames. This is like, pillars are starting to fall down. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't think pillars are starting to fall down, let me just ask you a very uncomfortable question. Unless you are pretty far into one particular camp, this is going to unsettle you. And if this doesn't unsettle you, you might want to reflect on if you're pretty far into some particular camp. Do you trust the ACLU anymore? Do you trust the American Civil Liberties Union anymore?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah, the pillar is on fire.
Mm-hmm.
The pillar is crumbling. If you don't trust, I mean, I don't trust the ACLU anymore. I've completely lost trust in the ACLU.
Okay.
I've lost trust in both of the political parties.
Well, I can definitely join you on that one. I've always had mixed feelings about the ACLU. That's honestly where I have been. I lack a knowledge base to make an informed decision, and so I know.
You should go read their Twitter feed for a minute.
I'm sure. I have definitely been disturbed by some of the things I've seen the ACLU say. On the other hand, I have been a proponent of the ACLU with certain, things that they have done that I've been very much behind. So
no, I hear you. I've had similar institutions as well, and it's just in the past, few months, I'm like, oh my god, the ACLU is basically a woke organ at this point. It's like, oh no.
And I could see that corruption occurring, and that's where the mixed bag came from. So yeah. I'm definitely tracking with what you're saying, and not having kept up or following what they were really up to these days, I couldn't speak intelligently about it. But
so let me jump on a point real quick there. Yeah. Then, so when critical methods, I should say, when critical theory comes into something, because it doesn't matter if it's on the woke side or if it's on the critical government side or any
sure.
critical religion, it doesn't matter where it is. Once critical methods come into something, that is a one-way street. The force that it takes to push it back out, you cannot allow it to work itself out. It will not work itself out. It will have to be somehow removed. I'm not saying we need to defund anything. I don't know what the method is. I know that in a lot of cases it means people have to be willing to take up committee roles. People have to be willing to get on boards and things they don't really want to do. They don't have time to do, because it's a one-way street. Two reasons. One is that it's actually being driven by activists. Critical theorists are by definition activism or activists.
That's right.
Being able to be put into activism is point number 2 out of 3. Like when Horkheimer defines a critical theory, he says it has to satisfy all 3 of these conditions. Number 2 is being able to be put into use by activists. So right. It is explicitly activist on purpose.
Right.
The more important.
It's almost you can almost branch it as like activist philosophy.
It is. It's activist philosophy. It's led to activist journalism. It's led to activist politicians. It's led to activist scholars. And this is not a healthy place to be. The other reason is because once something starts taking on critical methods, problematizing is so powerful psychologically that so for the ACLU, for example, a little bit of critical stuff gets in. They can't come back to normal stuff because now that's upholding the status quo, and they're going to get burned from within.
Right.
So the problematizing is going to get turned back on them. So it's only a slow march toward more and more and more woke until the thing, or more and more critical, I really should say, until the thing collapses. And because it just becomes critical and therefore more or less useless.
Wow.
Because it doesn't care about truth and falsity anymore. It
Yeah,
just cares
exactly.
about. So
It's
it's
building on in-group, out-group. When you talk about paranoia, it's built on paranoia of being in the out-group.
right.
Oh my God.
Being identified with the out group.
I might be the bad guy here. I don't want that.
This is where your authoritarian, your background in authoritarian thought is going to like flare up, because they repeatedly say there is no neutral. Ibram Kendi writes the book about anti-racism and wants to make a constitutional amendment that establishes an anti-racism office. And and so he says there's no such thing as neutral. You're either racist or you're anti-racist. There's no not racist. It's not like I'm riffing. He explicitly says not racist doesn't exist. They're either anti-racist or you're racist. Robin DiAngelo repeatedly writes that there is no neutral. You have to pick a side. To not pick a side is by default to pick the side of the oppressor, and because it's all oppressor versus oppressed dynamics and their worldview. So you have to pick a side. You have to get in one of the groups. You can't just say ignore this, because then you get categorized in one of the groups. And you can see how this, we didn't talk about it here, but you can see where we're going into robber's cave here real quick.
Yeah. Well, that is where it goes, and it is agitation. Let's keep something front and center here, right? This is agitation.
By activist philosophers, yes.
Actually, we talked about this before the podcast, and haven't we arrived at a perfect place to maybe talk about that again? Actually,
we can, yeah.
Let's do it. So. And then we'll wrap up on this, because I think it'll make the point we're trying to make really well.
Sure.
Okay, let me give a little backstory, folks, because we James and I had a little talk before the show started about this, and some of you might have seen, and I'll try to remember to link to this in the show notes, the description section of this video, that there was a UK Guardian article recently about a real life Lord of the Flies situation. And if you're not familiar with Lord of the Flies, it's a book written by William Goldman or Golding. In the 1960s, he was an alcoholic, and he had a pretty dim view of mankind following World War II and Korea and all that. And he wrote this book, fiction book, totally out of his head. It wasn't based on any psychology studies or anything like that. It was just a story about a bunch of boys who get stranded on a desert island and end up getting into very extremist behavior, killing one another, violence, tribalism, all the evil stuff that we all engage in, taken to an extreme level and demonstrated with this group of boys, English school kids. So then they get picked up by sailors, after a year or two or something, and one of them has been killed, and they're just this awful tribal mess. And the end line is, wow, you thought some British boys would have held up better, or been a better model of behavior, or something like that. You would have expected more from them. Okay, so that's a story, and everybody buys into it. They go, yeah, if a bunch of boys, human beings, you scratch the surface, there's the savage underneath. We're just waiting to come out. It's inherent in us. Look at these boys. If they were all left to their own devices, they would do this. And everybody bought into it and believed it. And it drastically affected our own view of ourselves socially. So, very influential book. I had to read it in school. So pretty much, if it gets to be mandatory reading in school, I consider it influential, because it's going to influence people's thinking from a very young age. Turns out, in the UK Guardian, there was an actual instance of this, where a group of young men from a Catholic boarding school took off one day in a boat, very, very not thinking the thought through. They went out there with like a line of fishing reel or something and some sandwiches, and ended up falling asleep in this boat, drifting off, being lost, stuck, get caught, or end up landing on this desert island. Long story short, they did great. They were out there for like a year and a half, if I remember the story right. Don't quote me on that part. Read the story. But they were there for long enough that they were all declared dead. Funerals were held. The families had given up. Sailors get out there, somehow come across these kids, and they get rescued much, much later. They're all fine. They had landed on this island. They all agreed from day one, we're not going to fight. We're going to get along. We're going to figure this out. We're going to survive. And they did. One of them even broke their leg. Now, these are teenage boys, hormone machines filled with pubescent hormones, right? These are wild kids. But they weren't wild. They actually conducted themselves quite well. And one of them, like I said, even fell off a cliff, broke his leg. They said it, I mean, with no medical training whatsoever. And when they all got picked up, the kid's leg had actually healed great. So point is, they got along. I'm sure there were scuffles and fights or whatever, but they made it work. That's the reality versus the fiction. But then we look at, okay, so that's one example. Then we look at this robber's cave. And would you like to explain what that situation was?
Yeah, I wish I could have had a chance to go look up who did it because I still can't remember. But
while you talk, I'll look it up.
It's the base. I'll be like, yes, it's the basis for what's called social identity theory. And so Robbers Cave was a highly unethical experiment that was performed, I believe, also in the 60s or late 50s. And the researcher, whose name I can't recall, took these boys.
Muzar Sharif?
Yes, that's it.
Yep, famous social psychologist.
Yes, Sharif. He took these boys to a campsite called Robbers Cave. These would have been, adolescents. I think they're white, somewhere like upper middle class boys. And he put them in two different campsites. The two groups of boys did not know the existence of each other. And, they named them the Rattlesnakes on the one side and, made them a team. And then he named them the Eagles on the other camp and made them a team. And had them do all these bonding activities. And is that right? Rattlesnakes and Eagles?
Yeah, they were 12-year-old boys. And there were 22 in the study, unknown to each other and all from white middle-class backgrounds. Protestant, two-parent background. None of the boys knew each other prior to the study.
And so they were separated from one another for some period of time, a week or so, had no idea the other group was there. And then he started to manipulate the situation. He would have it be to where, by the way, there's another group of boys. And, the reason that we have to have lunch in this bad place is because the other group trashed the lunch place. And it would tell both of them
the Eagles and the Rattlers, by the way. You had that right. And they even stenciled their names onto their shirts, and they had flags.
Yep, exactly. Right. So they had identifying markers that they made for themselves.
Yeah.
And so they each developed their own little internal culture. These things kind of got escalated to where he'd start to let them see the other group. And within a couple of weeks, the thing went to mayhem and they had to stop the experiment and get the boys out of there for their own safety because the tribalism had gotten so big that it was more like the fiction book Lord of the Flies. And, they were running raids on each other and it was starting to get reckless and almost violent. This in-group, versus out-group thinking really had flourished, where you had two different tribes of people. And then, of course, they were, and this was the point that you had raised, so maybe I should let you raise it, but it wasn't that they discovered each other organically.
Exactly. They were agitated. And I think that if we're going to look at these two incidents or this experiment, one of them was a calculated, premeditated experiment. The other was just organic. It just happened. And I can't obviously say that these boys who got stuck on this island are representative of all of humanity, but it's the only example we've got that directly refutes what we're thinking would happen in fiction versus the reality. It's polar opposite reality. So you take a group of boys very similar to these guys who crash landed, you agitate the hell out of them by dividing them into two teams, take a week to establish group identity, and then you turn them against each other and then assert, oh, look at how bad we all are because this is what we do. But if you take the agitator out of the equation, that's not how that social lineup has to happen. And I just found that conflict, that added element to be probably more important than maybe the experimenter realized.
It's really interesting because what was specifically happening was that he was agitating two things. One is group identity and the other is conflict theory. which, if you don't know the origin of the term conflict theory, that goes back to Marx also. And so now you have agitators who are trying to position people with some kind of a group identity, rattler, eagle, liberal, conservative, libertarian, and then all of a sudden they're trying to say that these groups are in conflict with one another, and they're trying to exacerbate that. That's where I get really concerned with the premise in Black feminism and critical race theory and intersectionality, which is now kind of blossomed into this idea of positionality, which is described in the literature as positionality must be intentionally engaged. Positionality is declaring all of your group identity markers. I'm a white man, but this or that, yeah, whatever it happens to be. As a good example actually is somebody that I saw that was saying, as a Black man, I understand systemic oppression, the experience of systemic oppression as a Black person, but as a man, I don't understand what my sisters experience under patriarchy and contribute to that. So I have to defer to them. I have to defer to women, but white men need to listen to me, and so on. So you have to do this. So they put this identity model forward where it's like, no, we're going to stop being colorblind. We're going to lean into a social identity category. We're going to make it politically relevant, and now we're going to explore it through critical theory, which is a form of conflict theory. And so we're going to agitate you into believing you have a social identity, and our social identities are in conflict.
Right.
And that is now taken to be the overwhelming model of how we're supposed to engage with identity issues. It's taught in our schools. It's the backbone of what's happening in a lot of our universities. It's being imported into it. Like, that's what diversity training at your office is. It's being imported into the workplace. It's being put into the government. I mean, it's literally our entire society is on fire with turning the whole place into robber's cave.
Let me throw this out as a conclusionary sort of statement, if I might invent that word, because I just realized something really disturbing about this whole thing.
So let me throw in one more identity.
Please, go ahead.
Because I don't want to come off like I'm just saying this is a problem from the left, because it's certainly not. Because the conservative movement.
Where I was going. That's right.
Okay, then you can do it.
Well, okay. I'm curious what you wanted to say, actually.
Because that started in the 70s.
Uh-huh.
In 1971, in fact, you can even date this whole idea. You can throw some names on it, like Newt Gingrich, and you can actually go and read the documents. You can read the names where a capital C conservative identity was put forward, and it was supposed to be conceived of as in opposition to the liberal agenda under the so-called New Deal order, which is why they're constantly picking at, trying to undo the New Deal. There's complications to this. There are parts where it's more critical. That would be kind of like Murray Rothbard. By the way, he was teamed up with the critical theorists during Vietnam. He was the right wing side, and the left wing side was Herbert Marcuse. But nevertheless, so you have a critical side to it, but you also have this kind of I don't think Gingrich is a critical theorist. He's a neocon. And so you have this conservative identity, though, and conservative identity has to be asserted against the liberal hegemony, this progressive hegemony that started really with the New Deal, started with the establishment of the Federal Reserve. And these are the regulatory administrative state. And these are the things that have to be torn down. So you have a conservative identity that's also using conflict theory. That's when you start looking at how we got so existentially polarized. And this is why I said earlier 1968 becomes so relevant, because that's really where both the left and the right fractured, not from each other, but within themselves, into a new left and an old left, and a new right and an old right. Neoconservatism versus old right, and the old left versus the new left, as they were actually called. And so you have this whole huge fracture point. Had a lot to do with the Vietnam War, as a matter of fact, being the first war on television. Had a lot to do with the social agitations and the philosophical agitations that were coming from both critical theory and postmodernism up to that point. Less postmodernism didn't really get influential till the 70s and 80s in the U.S. context, anyway. But you have this sort of morass in 1968 where all the radicalism kind of happened. Critical theory really started to mainstream. And you do have these entities who are trying to project conflict theory through hardcore identities, conservative, capital C conservative. I mean, I've watched my friends living in the South radicalize around deciding that they identify as conservative for decades.
Yeah.
It's like they have conservative tendencies, they're reasonable people, then all of a sudden they start saying, well, I'm a conservative person, I'm a conservative. Then once they start saying it, it's like all of a sudden they're into like weird shit. It's like they're buying 40 guns, they're having to buy literally thousands of rounds of ammo. And I don't care if people want to have guns, and I don't care. Fine. But it's like to watch somebody's behavior change radically around the idea that they've now taken on a particular political identity is the interesting thing here.
Big time.
Guns is a vestige of it. It doesn't matter.
Exactly. And don't get lost in the minutia of this, folks, because you can, there's trigger words all over the place here with race and color and gender and identity and guns. And don't get lost in all. Don't get distracted by that. We're talking about some basic philosophical points here that drive all of this. That's what we're trying to talk about. We're not trying to talk about guns.
We're talking about rattlers and eagles.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about, groups being created through identity politics, if you will, or identity ideology, and festered. That this conflict is created by people who are stirring the pot with these activist philosophies, if you will. And that's where it comes out. This is this whole thing about where is this coming from? Well, from the academic world, this is where it's coming from, and it leaks over into the ideological world. People start thinking certain ways. Politicians have to get on board, or people aren't going to listen to them. These key words start being used that don't mean what you think they mean, but you use them anyway because you think that you're saying one thing when they are saying something completely different. And that's where this gets really weird, really fast, and kind of hard to understand. So I'm hoping that we're putting this in a way that makes it clear that we're talking about people who are saying on a veneer basis, on a social basis, they're saying equal rights, equality of let's have a level playing field, let's get everybody on the same page. But you go just a little bit deeper and you see, no, that's not what they're doing at all. What they're doing is actually fostering and creating conflict because that's what they think is the inevitable condition of man anyway. So just run with it and let's just do it and let's just have a race war. And we've got that happening on the left, not just on the right. We talk about, I talk about the neo-Nazis and the Charlottesville and these guys protesting with guns now and this kind of stuff. These guys want to spark a race war. Just listen to Daryl Davis tell you all about it. He's friends with these people, right? And he knows what they talk about. They talk about sparking a race war. And I couldn't help but think, with everything we've talked about in this podcast, how is what they're doing, how is what these guys on the left are doing with these deep, heavy conflict philosophies any different? And how are they not sparking their own brand of race war and insisting that it be that way? And it must be because that's natural law and it's right and it's good and this is how things have to be.
They think that they can control it by pointing it in the opposite direction. And they think that, which is
the classic mistake in history.
Yes.
You think you're going to rile a bunch of people up and then you're going to be the one who's going to be in control of it. That is the mistake every single revolutionary leader has made in history. And
I keep getting made fun of, and I get called out by editors, and I had an editor complaining, making fun of me for it on Twitter today. In fact, wow. I keep using the metaphor of a dragon. You raise a dragon thinking it's not going to burn your house down.
Right. That's right. Good. Exactly. Good point. Wow, man. A little deep, huh? I contacted Dr. Lindsay because I wanted to talk about wokeness because it had come up recently and come across my plate. And like I said, I'd even been experiencing a little bit of it. And then we go all in on this. This has been fascinating.
Yep. There's a better way.
Yeah.
These issues matter and there's a better way.
That's right.
Again, it doesn't matter where you are, left, right, whether it's your demographic identity, whether it's your political identity. People really who are thoughtful and want things to actually get better need to stop and think for a minute and really decide if they want to invest in those kinds of identities or if they want to realize that the kids across the park are just more kids, if you will.
That's right.
That you could get to know, you can get along, you can disagree about some things. You can still have the Rattlers and the Eagles who have friendly competition and have their own thing. So it doesn't have to turn into Lord of the Flies. You don't have to invest that much in your political identity. I'm not even saying ideology, identity. You can have a political ideology. And maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't, depends on you. But when you take up a political identity and think about this stuff within, again, wokeness, the personal is political is one of their core mantras. You are, by your very nature, a political entity on one side or the other of as they actually frame it, it's not race war, it's identity wars, because queer isn't a race, but it is a core identity for them.
Right. Good point.
So so your identity, your intersectional mix of identities becomes politics.
Right.
You don't have to accept that. We can just, like, as Helen phrased it, I think, writing in our forthcoming book, she phrased it something like, the liberal view of homosexuality is some people are gay, get over it.
Mm.
And that's it. Some people are conservative, get over it. Some people are progressive, get over it. That's how it works. And we should reflect that back on ourselves, though, right? You don't have to take on the political identity. You don't have to keep throwing, as we started out talking about, you don't have to keep throwing rocks at the cathedral or the other cathedrals of society. It's actually possible to divest oneself of a political identity and try to get identities in things that maybe matter, like family or local community or a hobby that you're actually interested in. I do martial arts. My closest community is people across every possible political orientation you can imagine who actually like the same martial art I do, and then some other martial arts too, or whatever. We're friends. And so, you can get in, it can be based in activities, it can be based in community, civic engagement, things you care about. It doesn't all have to be politics all the time.
Exactly. And this idea that, you got to cancel other people if they disagree with you on something, this has really got to stop.
It's dangerous.
I disagree with all kinds of people on all kinds of things, but I don't, it just as a reflection. I mean, I'm not going to go troll somebody else's channel or social media page or something because I disagree with them about something. Okay, we got a disagreement, fine. But then when it becomes like I have to comment on our disagreement by insulting you deeply and personally, as a person, you're a narcissist, you're a this, you're that, you're a this phobe, you're a that phobe. You're not talking, you're not communicating there. That's not getting along, and that's not even trying to get along. And we've got to get over that because it's just destroying our society. That's my plea. Thanks.
That's a good point to end, man. That's strong.
Let's end it at that. Thanks very much for helping me with this and for contributing to my podcast this week. I really, really appreciate it. I think we covered some very good ground.
We definitely did. I'm excited about this.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you very much. And remind everybody again, how do you prefer to be contacted if people have questions for you directly or want to reach out to you for some reason?
You can, my direct messages for wisdom or folly are open on Twitter at Conceptual James. So you can reach me there. If you know how to go to my bio, you can figure out my email address and you can actually email me as well. I'm not private about what that is. I don't hide it. So either way, I will warn people, I won't do it ever without permission, but I'm thinking about I've started a platform, New Discourses, at newdiscourses.com. And I've been kind of coming along to this idea I think I'm going to experiment with, and I might do for a while. It may become kind of normal, a feature of James Explains. And if I do this, it's like, if you send me a question, I won't publish anything you've written without permission, but there's every likelihood I'll publish at least my answer and frame your question up. And if you give me permission to be quoted, it'll look kind of like Dear Abby if I think the question's good enough. So, reach out if you want. We can talk, but I would love to, like what we just did, where we worked through this, is what I like doing kind of best. and I feel most comfortable with. So, feel free to send those questions, and you might end up getting written back to, but then published about.
Awesome, man. Cool. All right, folks. Well, any questions, comments, or feedback, leave it in the comment section below on my channel here at YouTube or at sensiblyspeaking.com. I very, very, very much appreciate your feedback. I really do, whether it is good, bad, or sideways. I'm okay with that. But I'm not okay, as I want to say and will continue to say, because I think it's important, I am not down with being insulted. And if you don't come at me, I won't come at you. How's that? I think that's a healthy bargain. And I very much would like to engage with people, and I have something of a community right here on my own channel, but I don't want a toxic one. And it is a struggle for me as a free speech advocate to figure that out, what the line is on that. But I'm working it out. So, all right, folks, thanks for coming around, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.